Welcome to Northern Mystery Archives. Here we don't soften the truth and we don't skip the details. We investigate the forgotten files from the far north of Canada, the disappearances that were quietly shelved, the settlements that faded from every map, the transmissions that were never meant to be heard again. In this channel, nothing is hidden. Every fragment, every silence, every erased trail is examined with the seriousness these cases deserved but never received. If you value cold, atmospheric, minimalist investigations into the unexplained wilderness of the North, you're in the right place. Subscribe, stay close, and step with us into the files they hoped no one would ever revisit. Below, we will be speaking about the case titled Lydia Bracken, March 18, 1991, Unsolved Frozen Inlet Disappearance. It all began when... It carries the markings of a case that was never officially closed, but quietly abandoned nonetheless. The ink has faded on some of the pages. The photographs have yellowed at the edges. The evidence bags are still sealed, but the labels have started to peel away from the plastic. This is the file on Lydia Bracken, a woman who vanished from a frozen inlet on the 18th of March, 1991. The case was assigned a reference number that appears on fewer than a dozen documents. Most of those documents contradict one another. Some contain observations that were never followed up on. Others reference interviews that were never properly transcribed. What remains is a patchwork of fragmented testimony, environmental reports, and photographs of a landscape so desolate that it seems incapable of holding on to human presence for very long. Lydia Bracken was 43 years old when she disappeared. She worked as a regional environmental assessor for a federal agency that no longer exists in its original form. Her job required her to travel to isolated sites across the far north, documenting changes in water quality, ice thickness, and shoreline erosion. She was not inexperienced. She had been doing this work for more than a decade. She knew how to read the land, how to move through it, and how to survive when things went wrong. But on the morning of March 18th, something went wrong in a way that nobody has been able to reconstruct. The last confirmed communication from Lydia Bracken came at 6:47 in the morning. It was a radio transmission sent from her temporary field station on the western edge of an inlet known locally as Greywater Sound. The transmission was brief and contained no distress indicators. She reported stable weather, clear visibility, and an estimated departure time of 7:30. She was scheduled to complete a final survey of the inlet's ice coverage before packing up her equipment and returning to the staging area by midday. She never arrived. When the first search teams reached Greywater Sound 2 days later, they found her field station intact. The tent was still standing. Her sleeping bag was neatly rolled and secured. Her stove had been disassembled and packed away. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of animal intrusion, and no indication that she had left in a hurry. But Lydia herself was gone. So was her snowmobile, her survey kit, and a small canvas bag that she used to carry her field notes. What the searchers did find was a set of tracks leading out onto the ice. The tracks were consistent with the tread pattern of her snowmobile. They extended roughly 2 kilometers from the shoreline before they stopped. Not faded. Not obscured by wind or fresh snowfall. They simply stopped, as though the machine had lifted off the surface and continued into the air. The temperature that morning had been recorded at -19 degrees Celsius. The ice was thick enough to support vehicles. There were no open leads, no visible fractures, and no areas of thin ice within a 5-kilometer radius of where the tracks ended. Yet Lydia Bracken and her snowmobile had vanished from a stretch of frozen water that should have been as solid and predictable as the land itself. The official investigation was opened on March 20th. It was suspended 6 weeks later with no resolution. The case was never formally declared closed, but no active resources were assigned to it after the summer of 1991. Lydia Bracken remains listed as a missing person. Her file remains in a cabinet that nobody opens anymore. Greywater Sound is not a place that appears on most maps. It exists in the administrative records of resource management agencies and in the logbooks of pilots who fly over the region during the brief summer months. It is a narrow inlet that cuts inland from a larger bay, surrounded on three sides by low hills covered in black spruce and stunted birch. The shoreline is composed of fractured granite and glacial till. The water is shallow and cold, fed by runoff from higher elevations and by springs that remain active even in the deepest part of winter. The inlet freezes early in the season, usually by mid-November. The ice remains stable until late April or early May, depending on the year. During the winter months, the area is almost entirely uninhabited. There are no permanent settlements within 30 kilometers. The nearest outpost is a decommissioned weather station that has not been staffed since the mid-1980s. The only human presence comes from occasional survey teams, resource assessors, and independent trappers who pass through on routes that follow the old fur trade corridors. Lydia Bracken had been working in the region for 3 weeks when she disappeared. Her assignment was part of a broader environmental monitoring program that tracked ice thickness, water chemistry, and sediment deposition across multiple northern inlets. The work was repetitive and often solitary. It required patience, precision, and a tolerance for isolation. Lydia had all three. She had set up her field station on a flat stretch of land roughly 50 meters from the water's edge. The site was sheltered from the wind by a low ridge and offered a clear view of the inlet's frozen surface. She had pitched a standard four-season tent, installed a small wood-burning stove, and arranged her equipment in a manner that suggested she intended to stay for at least another week. Her supplies were adequate. Her fuel reserves were more than sufficient. There was nothing in the condition of the camp to suggest that she had been planning to leave ahead of schedule. The weather during the weeks leading up to her disappearance had been stable. Temperatures had remained consistently below freezing. Snowfall had been light and intermittent. Visibility had been good on most days. The conditions were not ideal, but they were far from dangerous. Lydia had worked in worse. The inlet itself was approximately 4 kilometers long and roughly 800 meters wide at its broadest point. The ice coverage that winter had been uniform and undisturbed. There were no pressure ridges, no areas of slush, and no evidence of recent fracturing. The ice had formed gradually over the course of several months, building up in layers that were dense and clear. Core samples taken after Lydia's disappearance showed ice thickness ranging from 60 to 90 centimeters across the surveyed area. This was well above the minimum threshold required for safe travel by snowmobile or on foot. Lydia's work involved drilling small test holes at regular intervals across the ice, measuring the depth of the ice at each location, and recording observations about color, clarity, and structure. She would then collect water samples from beneath the ice using a hand pump and store them in labeled containers for later analysis. The process was methodical and time-consuming. It required her to move across the ice in a systematic pattern, stopping frequently to take measurements and make notes. The last entry in her recovered field notes was dated March 17th. The handwriting was steady and legible. The observations were routine. She noted ice thickness at 3 separate test sites, recorded water temperature beneath the ice, and made a brief comment about the clarity of the ice near the center of the inlet. There was nothing in the entry to suggest concern, confusion, or distress. The notes ended mid-page. The rest of the notebook was blank. Greywater Sound is a place where silence accumulates. It is a landscape that absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. The morning of March 18th began, like the 13 mornings that had come before it. Lydia Bracken woke before dawn, prepared a simple breakfast over her stove, and completed her routine equipment checks. She had planned to conduct a final survey of the southern portion of the inlet before beginning the process of breaking down her camp. The weather was clear. The temperature was cold, but not extreme. There was no reason to delay. At 6:47, she made her scheduled radio check-in with the Regional Coordination Office. The transmission was received clearly and logged without incident. She reported no equipment malfunctions, no weather concerns, and no changes to her intended schedule. She confirmed that she would complete her survey work by midday and would be ready for pickup at the staging area by 1500 hours. The radio operator acknowledged her transmission and closed the call. It was the last time anyone heard from Lydia Bracken. Reconstruction of her movements after that point relies on physical evidence and environmental analysis. The tracks left by her snowmobile suggest that she departed her field station sometime between 7 and 7:30. She traveled in a southwesterly direction, following a route that took her out onto the ice in a gradual arc. The tracks were clear and consistent. There were no signs of erratic movement, no sharp turns, and no indication that she had stopped unexpectedly. The snowmobile she was using was a standard utility model commonly used for field work in northern regions. It was equipped with a two-stroke engine, a cargo rack, and a basic navigation kit. The machine had been serviced before the start of her assignment and was reported to be in good working condition. Fuel consumption records suggest that she had more than enough fuel to complete her planned route and return to her camp. The tracks extended for approximately 2 kilometers across the ice. They maintained a steady heading and showed no deviation from the path she would have taken to reach the southern survey sites. Then, without warning, the tracks stopped. Not gradually, not in a way that suggested a slow halt or a deliberate change of direction. They simply ended, as though the machine and its operator had ceased to exist at that precise point. Search teams arriving at the site 2 days later documented the scene with photographs and measurements. The final track impression was clear and well-defined. The tread pattern was intact. The depth of the impression was consistent with the weight of the snowmobile and a single rider. There was no disturbance in the snow ahead of the final track, no signs of impact, no evidence of the machine tipping over or sinking. The surface of the ice beyond the last track was smooth and unbroken. Core samples taken at the location where the tracks ended showed solid ice more than 70 centimeters thick. There were no cracks, no voids, and no areas of weakness. The ice was as structurally sound at that point as it was anywhere else on the inlet. Below the ice, the water depth was measured at just under 4 meters. The bottom was composed of fine silt and organic debris. Side-scan sonar conducted during the initial search detected no large objects beneath the ice, no snowmobile, no human remains, nothing that could account for the sudden termination of the tracks. The weather on the morning of March 18th had been calm. Wind speeds were recorded at less than 10 kilometers per hour. Visibility exceeded 5 kilometers. There had been no snowfall in the preceding 24 hours. Conditions were as close to ideal as they ever are in that part of the north. There was no environmental factor that could explain what had happened. Interviews with other personnel working in the region at the time revealed nothing unusual. No one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. No aircraft had been operating in the area. No other survey teams had been scheduled to work near Greywater Sound. Lydia Bracken had been alone, and then she had been gone. The search expanded over the following days to include the surrounding shoreline, the forested areas adjacent to the inlet, and the network of frozen streams that fed into the sound. Ground teams moved methodically across the landscape, looking for any sign of her or her equipment. Helicopters flew low-altitude grid patterns over the ice. Divers were brought in to search beneath the ice in areas where the depth allowed. Nothing was found. The official investigation into Lydia Bracken's disappearance was led by a regional detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The case was assigned to a senior investigator with experience in remote search and recovery operations. The investigator's name appears on the initial incident report, but has been redacted from most subsequent documents. What remains in the file are his notes, observations, and a series of increasingly frustrated assessments of the evidence that failed to lead anywhere. The first priority was to establish whether Lydia had left the area voluntarily. Her personal history was reviewed in detail. Financial records were examined. Communications with family and colleagues were analyzed. Nothing suggested that she had any reason to disappear. Her bank accounts showed no unusual activity. Her correspondence contained no hints of distress or dissatisfaction. She had made plans for work assignments that extended several months into the future. She had been scheduled to attend a conference in the fall. She had been expecting a delivery of new field equipment in late spring. Everything pointed to someone who intended to continue with her life as it had been. The possibility of an accident was explored next. The tracks on the ice were analyzed by multiple experts. Engineers examined the ice core samples. Mechanical specialists reviewed the snowmobile's maintenance records. Environmental scientists studied the weather data and the hydrological conditions of the inlet. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. There was no plausible mechanism by which the snowmobile could have broken through the ice, sunk into the water, and left no trace. The physics simply did not support it. Interviews were conducted with everyone who had been working in the region during the relevant time period. Pilots who had flown over the area in the days before and after the disappearance were questioned. Radio operators who had logged communications with Lydia were asked to review their records. Other field personnel who had worked with her in the past were contacted and asked if they had noticed anything unusual in her behavior or circumstances. No useful information emerged. The investigators' notes contain references to several anomalies that were never fully explained. One entry mentions a radio transmission that was logged at the regional office approximately 2 hours after Lydia's scheduled check-in on the morning of March 18th. The transmission was brief and garbled. The audio quality was poor. No words could be clearly distinguished. The signal was traced to a frequency that Lydia's radio was known to use, but the transmission could not be definitively attributed to her equipment. Attempts to contact the source of the transmission received no response. The event was noted in the file, but not pursued further. Another entry describes an observation made by a trapper who had passed through the area several days after Lydia's disappearance. The trapper reported seeing what appeared to be a set of tracks leading from the ice onto the western shoreline of the inlet. The tracks were not consistent with snowmobile treads. They were described as unusual in shape and spacing. The trapper did not follow the tracks, but noted their location on a hand-drawn map that was later provided to investigators. A search team was dispatched to the area, but found nothing. The snow had been disturbed by wind and animal activity. No tracks could be confirmed. A third anomaly involved a piece of equipment that was recovered several weeks after the initial search. A small metal case containing water sample vials was found on the ice, roughly half a kilometre north of where Lydia's tracks had ended. The case was identified as part of her survey kit. The vials inside were intact and labelled with dates and locations. The most recent sample was dated March 17th. The case showed no signs of damage. There was no explanation for how it had come to be separated from the rest of her equipment, or why it had been found in a location that she would not have passed through based on the trajectory of her snowmobile tracks. The investigators' final report, submitted in late April of 1991, concluded that Lydia Bracken had disappeared under circumstances that could not be adequately explained by the available evidence. The report recommended that the case remain open pending the discovery of new information. It also recommended that additional resources be allocated to conduct a more thorough search of the surrounding region. Neither recommendation was acted upon. In the months following the suspension of the search, several attempts were made to generate renewed interest in the case. Lydia's family hired a private investigator who traveled to the region and conducted interviews with local residents. The investigator produced a report that raised questions about the thoroughness of the initial search and suggested several areas that had not been adequately covered. The report was submitted to the RCMP but did not result in any additional action. A journalist working for a regional newspaper attempted to write a feature article about the disappearance. The journalist traveled to Greywater Sound and spent several days documenting the site. Photographs were taken, maps were drawn. Interviews were conducted with members of the original search teams. The article was written and submitted for publication, but was never printed. The journalist later stated that the story had been pulled due to concerns about accuracy and lack of corroboration. The unpublished draft remains in a private collection. It contains observations that do not appear anywhere else in the official record. The case file was transferred to cold case status in 1993. Theories about what happened to Lydia Bracken have circulated in the years since her disappearance. Some are grounded in logic and evidence, others rely on speculation and coincidence. None have been proven, none have been definitively ruled out. The most straightforward theory is that she fell through the ice despite the apparent thickness and stability of the frozen surface. Proponents of this theory argue that localized weaknesses in the ice, caused by factors such as underwater currents or pockets of warmer water, could have created conditions that allowed the snowmobile to break through. They point to the fact that the inlet is fed by several springs and that variations in water temperature beneath the ice are not always detectable from the surface. However, this theory is contradicted by the ice core samples, which showed no evidence of structural compromise. It is also contradicted by the absence of any visible fracture or disruption at the point where the tracks ended. The ice was solid. The water beneath it was cold and still. There was no mechanism for a sudden collapse. A second theory suggests that Lydia abandoned her snowmobile and continued on foot. This theory is based on the assumption that she may have encountered a mechanical failure or run out of fuel and decided to walk back to her camp or to seek help elsewhere. However, this theory does not explain why the snowmobile was never found. It also does not explain why no footprints were observed leading away from the point where the tracks ended. Search teams documented the scene carefully. The snow was undisturbed. If Lydia had left the machine and walked away, there should have been evidence of it. A third theory involves the possibility of foul play. Some have suggested that Lydia was abducted or harmed by another person who was in the area at the time. This theory is supported by the fact that her body was never found and by the presence of certain unexplained elements in the case, such as the garbled radio transmission and the misplaced sample case. However, there is no evidence of another person being present in the area. There were no other tracks on the ice, no other vehicles were reported in the region, no witnesses came forward. The isolation of Greywater Sound makes the involvement of another person unlikely, though not impossible. A fourth theory posits that Lydia staged her own disappearance. This theory is based on the idea that she may have had personal or professional reasons to leave her life behind and start over elsewhere. Proponents of this theory point to the orderly condition of her field station and the lack of any signs of distress or struggle. They suggest that she may have arranged for someone to pick her up from the ice and transport her to another location. However, this theory is contradicted by the absence of any motive. Lydia's personal and professional life showed no signs of instability or dissatisfaction. She had no known debts, no legal troubles, and no relationships that were causing her stress. She had no reason to disappear. A fifth theory involves environmental factors that are not fully understood. Some researchers have suggested that unusual atmospheric or electromagnetic conditions in the region could have played a role. These suggestions are vague and largely speculative. They rely on phenomena that have not been documented or verified. They are mentioned here only because they appear in the unofficial accounts of the case and in conversations with people who have spent time in the area. Local residents and those familiar with the region have their own theories. Some speak of the land itself as though it has agency. They describe Greywater Sound as a place where things are lost more easily than they should be. They reference other disappearances, other incidents where people or equipment have gone missing under circumstances that defy explanation. These accounts are difficult to verify. They exist primarily as oral history, passed down through families and trappers and pilots who know the land better than anyone else. They are not evidence. But they are part of the context in which Lydia Bracken's disappearance must be understood. The official stance remains that the case is unresolved. The file on Lydia Bracken has not been opened in more than a decade. The pages inside have yellowed further, the photographs have faded, the evidence bags remain sealed, though the contents have degraded with time. The case is still technically active, but no resources are assigned to it. No one is looking for Lydia anymore. No one is searching the frozen inlet where she disappeared. The land has moved on. The seasons have continued. The silence that has always defined Greywater Sound has absorbed whatever answers may still exist. Lydia Bracken was 43 years old when she vanished. She was experienced, competent, and familiar with the risks of working in isolated northern environments. She had survived more than a decade of fieldwork in some of the most inhospitable regions of the country. She knew how to read the land. She knew how to stay safe. And yet, on the morning of March 18, 1991, she drove out onto a frozen inlet and disappeared in a manner that has never been explained. The tracks left by her snowmobile extended 2 kilometers across the ice and then stopped. The ice beneath the tracks was solid and undamaged. The water below was cold and still. There was no fracture, no collapse, no disruption. The machine and its operator simply ceased to exist at that point, as though they had crossed some invisible threshold beyond which the normal rules of cause and effect no longer applied. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately futile. Every lead was pursued, every theory was examined, every piece of evidence was analyzed. Nothing led anywhere. The case was suspended after 6 weeks and has remained in a state of suspension ever since. Lydia Bracken is still listed as a missing person. Her name appears in databases and registries. Her photograph is still on file, but no one expects her to be found. Her family has not given up. They have continued to search in their own way, reaching out to investigators, hiring private consultants, and keeping her name alive in the hope that someone, somewhere, might have information that was overlooked. They have spoken to journalists and researchers. They have provided interviews and shared documents. They have done everything they can to ensure that Lydia's disappearance is not forgotten. But the years have passed, and the silence has deepened, and the answers have not come. Greywater Sound remains as it was. The inlet freezes in November and thaws in May. The ice forms in layers, thick and clear and cold. The shoreline is unchanged. The black spruce and stunted birch stand in the same places they have always stood. The land absorbs sound and presence and memory with equal indifference. It is a place where disappearance feels less like an event and more like a natural process. A place where absence is the default state, and where what is lost stays lost. There are other cases like this one, other files in other cabinets, other disappearances that defy explanation. They accumulate slowly, one at a time, each one a small rupture in the fabric of what we think we understand about the world. They are not connected, except by their refusal to be resolved. They are not part of a pattern, except in the sense that they all involve people who went into the northern wilderness and did not come back. Lydia Bracken is one of those people. Her case is one of those files, and Greywater Sound is one of those places. The inlet will freeze again this winter. The ice will form in layers, thick and clear and cold. The silence will return, as it always does. And the answers, if they exist, will remain buried beneath the surface, waiting for a spring that may never come.